When I was a young man, I was cursed. This is how I survived. When I was a young man, I was cursed. I don't know how or by who. I don't know if it was an accident or a deliberate attempt at ruining my life, and at this point, I doubt I ever will. I don't know which one would be worse. In the end, I guess it doesn't matter. I'm 76 years old now. I was born in a mid-sized town in a mid-sized county into a mid-sized family. I was a good kid. As good as anyone else, I guess. People weren't as good then as they are now, though, but I hardly see that as being my fault. But sometimes I've wondered if I ever did harm someone badly enough for them to curse me, if I was the villain in someone's story. But I don't know what that something or who that someone could have been. I did my schoolwork, I played baseball, I hung out with my friends. Normal stuff. But when I was 17, something changed. Something sinister entered my life. I keep thinking back to that time, and if there was something I missed. Something I'd done, or someone had done unto me. But as is often the case, the roots are buried somewhere beneath, out of sight. Just under our footsteps, never in front of us. I began to see shadows where there weren't none. Sometimes they were in the windows, blocking the sunlight like an ephemeral fog. Other times they rose up into dark and thin creatures in the distance, like sprouting trees. Those same shadows started to invade my dreams, and I'd wake up in a cold sweat with my hands in taut fists, the fingernails digging deep into my palms. And when I couldn't sleep, or sometimes outright refused to, they began to walk on our rooftop. I'd hear their steps, up and down, around and over, like they were playing hide and seek. I wondered how shadows could make footsteps. Often I wrapped a pillow around my head to drown them out. But the tighter I pulled the pillow, the harder they stomped. My parents nor my siblings never heard a peep. After a while, I entered a state of constant drowsiness, which quickly reflected on my day-to-day life. I couldn't concentrate at school, as I would sleep through all my classes. Those noisy classrooms were busy enough to grant me some peace from those things. They couldn't do much in large crowds. Those were the only times when I could sleep peacefully. Have a break. Soon I didn't have the energy to play sports or hang out with friends anymore. My friends, along with my parents, asked me questions I had no answers to. Had I started taking drugs? Hanging out with the wrong people? Gotten some illness? Funnily enough, nowadays I feel like all my symptoms pointed to depression. But in those days the word was used purely in its economic context. Nowadays it's easier to talk about such things, but back then, there was no way. I'd be sent to the loony bin in a quick second. And a padded, isolated room sounded like a death trap. Probably would have been, in a very literal sense. As often as I could, I'd sneak out of the house at night and try to get into any of the local bars. Seeing as they were deterred, or at least somewhat incapacitated, by large groupings of people, incidentally. Bars were the only places during the night which granted me that veil of protection. Sometimes I got in, oftentimes not. If they shooed me away, it was a long and anxious walk back home. They'd gotten closer and closer, more familiar, more brave. I saw them climb around fences and up on the roofs of buildings, just staring at me. Sometimes I ran home. But there was one bar that let me in pretty much every time. It was quite a long walk away, but the owner, Andy, was a good guy. The first time I went there, as I went to order a beer, I could see that he was about to tell me to take a hike. I never looked old for my age. But when he looked at me, I mean really looked at me, something in his mannerism seemed to change. Maybe it was the bags under my eyes or the defeated posture I held. But I like to think that Andy thought that wherever I'd go back to would be worse than there in that bar. So Andy let me stay. The establishment itself was, I guess, what you would call a dive bar. To get into the semi-basement, you had to walk down these uneven concrete steps that also functioned as an impromptu outdoors urinal, giving them a consistently wet, ammonia-marinated quality. All the windows were small and high up the walls, showing a curbside view of people's feet as they walked past. Inside was the bartable itself, lackluster in choices of drink, and around the room were round wooden tables and an array of different kinds of chairs, no two of which were the same kind. In its own way, it was kind of cozy. I couldn't always make the trip. The walk was too long and filled with too many shadows, but I tried as often as I could. But every time I did go, Andy had saved me a seat. When it was quiet, usually during the early evening or late night, we'd get to talking. Just small talk about something funny that had happened at the bar or how the weather was looking. It was nice to get to do something normal, to feel some connection to humanity again. After a few weeks, I'd developed a new routine. I'd sleep at school, and I'd head over to Andy's as quickly as I could before the dark set in. Andy wouldn't serve me alcohol, but he went through the trouble of giving me apple juice in a whiskey glass to give the right appearance, I guess. I stayed even after Andy kicked everyone else out, and I helped him clean up. We'd walk out together, but once he was out of view, heading to his place on the other side of town, I'd sprint back home. When the streets were empty and the light was low, I'd hear them whispering. From alleyways and under broken street lamps I could see their elongated forms taking shape, but I never looked long enough to see their full form. Somehow I knew that if I did, that'd be it. My end. I started bringing some of my school books with me to do just enough homework so I wouldn't fail my classes. Even with the faux whiskey, I must have looked out of place, but no one ever gave me trouble. I think Andy had something to do with that. One night me and Andy were talking, and he said he had something important to tell me. He never had anything important to say, which was a trait that served him well as a bartender. I was sure he was going to tell me I was no longer welcome, that it wasn't good for him to host some stray kid every night. But the truth was much worse. "Donnie, listen," he began, his voice entirely devoid of his regular bartender's joviality. "I'm moving." "Moving where?" I asked, hoping that he simply meant he'd move to a new apartment, and maybe he'd need to close earlier, or start charging more, or maybe he'd found a new bar, something closer to me perhaps, or something. "Connecticut. I'm leaving." I couldn't believe it. Or I could, but I knew that without Andy and his bar I'd be shit out of luck. I needed this place. It was the only thing keeping me safe. And although I wished Andy nothing but the best of the best, what came out of my mouth was, "You can't leave." He sighed and put down the scratched glass he'd been drying so long the act had evolved into futile polishing. "I've been thinking about it for a while. All my family's there, and now my dad's sick. I need to go there and help out. I'm sorry." And I believed him. But I needed him. "Where am I supposed to go, Andy?" I asked him. "What will I do without you?" "Go home," he said, then sighed again, this time with utter defeat in his voice. "Look, I know that there's some reason you're out here every night. Things must be hard for you at home, and I've never asked you why. That's your business, and I respect that. But you're gonna be 18 soon, so I strongly advise you to get the hell out of Dodge. Leave, find some job, and make your own life." Tears began to well in my eyes. "I can give you some cash if you need it," he said. "It's not that," I said, as I wiped the tears on my sleeve with quick swoops. "It's..." "What?" "Come on, you can tell me," he said, with slight agitation in his voice. He put the glass in a cupboard behind him, slamming it down harder than he needed to. And as the myriad ways in which I could explain what I was going through tumbled through my mind, one obvious and concrete idea seemed to come up more than others. I hadn't thought to put it into words before, but this particular word was, in all its ridiculousness, perfect. "I'm cursed, Andy," I said. For a moment it seemed like he stopped breathing, and his eyes looked as if they were assessing me in the same way he assessed his real whiskey-drinking patrons for signs to cut them off. "Cursed," he finally answered, and that was enough acknowledgement for me to spill my guts out. I told him everything, and when I was done, I felt embarrassed, crazy, even, but also a little bit lighter. Andy was quiet for a while after that. I dared not look at him. I wanted him to process what I'd told him, give him the chance to make up his mind on his own. I mean, it was a ludicrous idea, and anything more I'd say would probably only strengthen any disbelief he held. So I let him stir. He began to do his final rounds, putting chairs back under the tables and checking the locks. I was sure he'd had enough. He was finally kicking me out, sniffed out my bullshit, realized that I've been pulling his leg all this time. He stood by the door with the keys to the bar in his hand, looking at me. "Show me," he said. I didn't even know if I could show him, if the curse was a purely subjective one, or if others really could see those dark shadows lurking. But I had to try, so I walked outside without saying a word, and he followed, locking the door behind us. "I'll walk you home," he said. "All the way." And so we began to walk. At first they seemed reluctant to come forth, and for once when I needed them, they wouldn't show. Maybe they were smart like that. We walked for almost half of the trip without saying a word, and with nothing at all happening. Andy kept looking around, but his swiveling head began to turn less and less, until he was simply staring forward with a disappointed and worried look on his face. With no less than a quarter-mile from home, I saw it. It was standing on the slanted rooftop of a fancy, Midwest modern home. It seemed to emerge from the darkness of night itself, its features diminished and visible only by the aura of faint street lamps. But it was there. Its body stood at least 9 feet tall, with long, sharp arms that seemed to drag on well below its knees. Its face was blurred, but I knew it was looking at me. My legs screamed in agony for permission to run. But they stalled. I had to stall. This was my last chance. Andy walked a few feet in front of me until he realized I was no longer by his side. He turned towards me with palpable confusion. When I looked at him, I realized my eyes were strained from how unnaturally open I'd kept them, with teardrops forming at their edges. I wasn't sure what to do, so I simply looked at the rooftop again and asked him, "Do you see it?" I'm not sure if I was relieved or death scared when he simply said yes. Without a word, we began to run.